Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here, and happy Feast of Christ the King. And I want to say a few words about this feast and why we consider Jesus a king worthy of our worship and devotion. First of all, as Americans, we don't have a king. We've had major protests where, as a country, we have screamed loud and clear, no kings. And this goes back, of course, to our founding fathers, where they eventually rejected the monarchy of England. So we as Americans don't have a monarchy. We're not used to kings. And there are all these associations of the king as amassing power and as a wealthy and amassing more wealth. Oftentimes they're capricious and aloof and distant and uncaring. Kings can sometimes, and tyrants and dictators can be quite brutal and cruel and unjust, with no care for the average person, often out of touch with the average person. And yet we call Jesus the king of the universe. But when you look at his ministry and his life and his death, he certainly didn't act like the usual king. He certainly didn't act like Herod. He certainly didn't act like Caesar Augustus or like a Pilate. Instead, Jesus is calling people to him. He's reaching out to the most vulnerable and needy, the blind, the widow, the lame. He's offering them healing. He's feeding the hungry. He's calling for forgiveness and compassion. He's sitting down and having meals with the outcasts, with sinners, with those who are disrespected. So he doesn't act like a king at all in the normal sense. He certainly doesn't act like Caesar or any kind of tyrant. And when he's attacked and accused and mocked, he doesn't lash out. He doesn't send forces to attack them. He doesn't send his supporters to attack folks. There's not a word of condemnation from him. Even when he appears to the disciples after his death, he never condemns them for betraying or denying him or running away. And in fact, Jesus dies powerless at the hands of the dominant forces. And any king who dies is not a king. And so Jesus doesn't act like a king at all, and yet we call him the King of Kings. We associate him with being the king of the universe. And so the first thing you have to realize is that Jesus is transforming what we mean by king. He's in effect turning around and creating a whole new vision of what king means. It means, from Jesus' perspective, service, care of the poor and the lonely and the vulnerable. So to be a king in the model of Jesus is to be a king who institutes a kingdom of peace and justice and truth, a kingdom where it's not the most powerful and the most beautiful and the wealthiest who receive the most attention. No, in his kingdom, the people who receive the most attention are the neediest, the most vulnerable, those who are most enslaved and need to be freed, who need compassion and kindness. So he's introducing a whole new idea of kingdom and king. Now, why do we think of Jesus as a king? Well, on one level, this is emerging out of the first century, where the early church is trying to come up with an image that evokes a sense in us of devotion, of loyalty, of respect, because from the death and resurrection of Jesus, the early church discovers and realizes that in and through him, God is healing and reconciling the whole world, the whole cosmos. In and through Jesus, he's transforming all things. And the early church quickly realizes that the reason that the risen Jesus can heal people and free people and reconcile all things and begin to establish peace among warring factions and warring communities and change lives is because the very power of God to create is at work in him. And so the early church begins to look back and see that not only is Jesus the one through whom God will heal and reconcile and restore and renew the world, but Jesus is the one through whom God has created all things. And so this weekend, we were invited to listen to the beginning of Paul's letter to the Colossians. And I highly encourage you to read this first chapter. It is so beautiful. And Paul begins by saying, let us give thanks to God the Father, because through Jesus, God has, number one, delivered us from the kingdom of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of light. This is not something he will do in the future. It's present tense. In other words, because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, we now are receiving the power that raised Jesus from the dead, the very power that created all things. And that power is freeing us and freeing our world from the forces of injustice and greed and cruelty and violence and death itself, and delivering us from that and moving us into a kingdom of justice and peace and love. So that's the first reason we should give thanks to God and worship Jesus and see that he is the real king, the true king, who's freeing us in our world from these dark forces that today seem to be so prevalent. And he's delivering us into a new kingdom, not in heaven, but here, where he's the king, a kingdom of peace and justice. Here's the second reason we think Jesus is the king of the world. And it's right at the beginning of this hymn in Colossians, where Paul says that through Jesus, through him, God created all things. And so there's this rethinking and understanding of how God creates. So in this hymn, behind this hymn is Genesis chapter 1, when God speaks and God creates the whole cosmos. Because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, the early church rethinks God creating and realizes that God does it in and through Jesus. And so the second reason we worship Jesus as king is because it is in and through him that God creates all things. So think of every good thing in your life. Your husband and wife and mother and father. The fact that you exist and have health. The fact that I'm here in this beautiful environment with the sun and oxygen and trees. My kids and my wife. My job, my career. All of this comes from God through Jesus. And so this realization moves us to give thanks to him. But then the final reason this Colossians hymn gives us for thinking of Jesus as the king is because it says, through his death, we now have peace with God. Through his death, heaven and earth are being reconciled. All of humanity is being reconciled. Each of us is being reconciled. He's healing the massive divisions, the cosmic divisions, the divisions on earth, the divisions within our friendships and families, the divisions within our hearts. And this is the final reason why he is the true king that we should give our devotion to and worship. Now, my last point here is once you begin to understand why we think Jesus is the King of Kings, the King of the cosmos, once you understand what kind of king he is, down with us, he's with us in all things. He's with the poor and the lonely and the lost, fighting injustice, trying to bring about peace and healing. Once you get that, we also realize that Jesus stands as a massive critique of every leader, of every king, of every tyrant. And he offers a prophetic critique of any king, any president, any leader who is unjust, who uses violence, who is cruel to the immigrant, to the legal and illegal. He provides a prophetic critique, a no, to all leaders that use violence against their own people, that condemn other people, that promote cruelty and violence and injustice and greed and seek to amass power and wealth for themselves. And Jesus says a no to him. So my friends, let us worship him. Let us adore him. Let us give our loyalty to him, and let us cooperate with him to resist all those forces and all those leaders who are opposed to his kingdom.